Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're diving into the case of Joseph Edward Duncan III.
Okay.
Our main source material for this one is his Wikipedia article.
Right.
And, this is going to be a tough one.
Yeah.
This is a very sensitive topic,
Yeah,
obviously.
of course.
We want to approach it with respect for the victims and really focus on trying to understand Duncan's actions without sensationalizing them.
Right.
And, I think one of the things that makes this deep dive particularly compelling is that, Duncan's case isn't just about, one isolated crime.
Right.
It's really about, this horrifying pattern of escalating violence.
Yeah.
That really went unchecked for years.
For sure.
And it raises a lot of questions, I think, about systemic failures.
Yeah.
And how to prevent these kinds of tragedies.
Absolutely. And I think it's crucial that we don't just examine like what he did.
Right.
But we look at how he was able to do it for so long.
Right, exactly.
That's where the real learning comes in.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's start with the crime that kind of brought him into the national spotlight.
Okay.
The 2005 murders and kidnappings of the Green family in Idaho.
Yeah, this case just shocked the nation.
Yeah.
Just for its brutality.
Yeah.
Brenda Green, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her 13-year-old son Slade were found murdered in their home.
Wow.
But the horror didn't stop there.
Right.
Brenda's two other children, Shasta, who was 8, and Dylan, who was 9, were missing.
Yeah. And it was a nationwide search. And what made it so terrifying, I think, was just the lack of a clear motive.
Right.
It wasn't just a random burglary gone wrong. It seemed targeted.
Right.
And intensely violent.
And the details that emerged, as the case went on, it became clear this was not just a random act. This was the work of someone deeply disturbed.
Right.
And when Shasta was rescued 7 weeks later, it revealed this unimaginable ordeal that she and Dylan had endured.
Yeah, Shasta was found at a Denny's in Coeur d'Alene.
Right.
But sadly, Dylan wasn't with her.
Duncan eventually led authorities to his remains in Montana.
Right.
And the details of their captivity, as Shasta, revealed them,
Yeah.
they're truly horrifying.
Yeah, it goes way beyond kidnapping. It was torture. It was abuse.
Right.
It was just this calculated campaign of terror.
And what's so crucial for our deep dive, here, is that this wasn't Duncan's first brush with the law.
Right. This was not a sudden snap.
Yeah.
This guy, his history of violence goes way back.
Wow.
Starting in his teens.
So this was a pattern that was already established.
Definitely established.
Tell me about his early crimes.
So at 15, he commits his first recorded sex crime.
Oh, wow.
Rapes a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint.
Oh, my gosh.
By 16, he's admitted to raping 13 boys.
That's unbelievable.
So this early escalation, I think, is a huge red flag.
Yeah.
It suggests this really deep-seated pathology that, if it had been addressed, then who knows what could have happened.
It's almost unbelievable that someone could be capable of these acts at such a young age.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, were there any attempts at intervention?
Right.
I mean, was there anything that could have been done to stop him back then?
I think that's one of the biggest questions we're going to be grappling with as we go through this whole thing.
Yeah.
But the pattern just continues.
Okay.
A year later, at 16, he abducts and rapes a 14-year-old boy, and this time leads to his first major prison sentence.
Okay.
He served time, was released on parole in 1994.
Okay.
And sadly, that's when his crimes kind of escalated to a whole new level.
This raises a lot of questions about how we handle the release of violent offenders, especially those who commit sex crimes. I mean, what safeguards were in place? Was there any kind of monitoring of his activities after he was released?
These are all great questions, and we'll dig into, the whole parole system and how effective it is or isn't. But I think first we should trace how Duncan's arrest in the Garain case really became this catalyst for uncovering all these other unsolved crimes.
Okay, so we're starting to see how this case goes far beyond just one family's tragedy.
Absolutely.
And becomes this sort of national investigation.
Yeah.
Uncovering this web of interconnected crimes.
Right.
What was the first domino to fall after the Grain case?
Well, DNA evidence linked Duncan to the 1997 murder of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California.
Oh, wow.
And the parallels to the Grain case were just chilling.
Yeah.
A young boy abducted, signs of sexual assault, the body deliberately concealed.
So not only is there this pattern of violence, but there's also a specific modus operandi emerging. A
Yes.
signature that links these crimes together.
Exactly. And as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more.
Oh,
Duncan eventually confessed to the 1996 murders of 2 young girls in Seattle.
gosh.
Samio White, who was 11, and Carmen Cubius, who was 9.
Wow.
Their disappearance had haunted the city for years. And now, the truth, as horrible as it was finally coming to light.
It's really staggering to think about the scope of his crimes. You know, the number of lives he destroyed, the pain that he inflicted across multiple states,
Right.
and the fact that he operated undetected for so long is, frankly, terrifying.
It is terrifying, and it raises, questions about how we define justice.
Yeah.
Yes, Duncan was apprehended and he faced multiple trials.
Right.
But can the legal system ever truly provide closure
Right.
for the families of his victims, for the communities he terrorized?
That's a really good question, and that's something we'll definitely explore further as we kind of delve into the legal proceedings that followed his arrest.
Okay.
We'll examine the 3 separate trials in Idaho federal court in California
Right.
and unpack, the complexities of sentencing someone who committed such unspeakable acts.
Yeah.
But before we get into the legal aspects,
Yeah,
I think it's essential to try to understand the man behind these crimes.
for sure.
And that leads us to, I think, a rather unsettling aspect to this case.
Thank
Duncan's online presence.
Right.
His website, The Fifth Nail.
Yeah.
It's a chilling name
Yeah.
that hints at something, dark and disturbing lurking beneath the surface.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about this site?
Well, before his arrest, Duncan used this website to present this carefully crafted persona to the world. He wanted people to think that he was this reformed offender,
Oh, wow.
someone who had overcome a troubled past.
Oh,
But reading between the lines, there were all these disturbing clues.
real.
Hints of his rage, his fascination with violence, his distorted views on society and morality.
So it wasn't just a personal blog about, his daily life.
No.
It was more like a platform for his twisted ideology.
He was.
A way to manipulate public perception and potentially even groom future victims.
It's a chilling possibility that we're going to have to consider as we go through all of this. And,
Right.
it's a reminder that the internet can be a double-edged sword.
Right.
A tool for connection and communication, but also a breeding ground for, darkness and deception.
It's a reminder that the most disturbing aspects of this case aren't just about, one man's actions.
Right.
They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Yeah.
About, how we deal with the potential for violence in our midst.
Yeah.
About the systems that we rely on for protection.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this deep dive so crucial.
Right.
It's not just about understanding the past.
Yeah.
It's about learning from it,
Right.
applying those lessons to the present,
Right.
and hopefully preventing future tragedies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
It's a tall order, but
it is, but it's important.
yeah, it
Yeah.
is. So we ended part 1 talking about Duncan's website, The Fifth Nail, and how it was this platform for his disturbing views.
Right.
But his online activity didn't end there.
Yeah.
He also maintained a blog called The Fifth Nail Exposed while he was on death row.
And I have to admit, diving into the mind of a serial killer through his own words,
Yeah.
it's a bit unsettling.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
But, our goal here isn't to sensationalize his crimes
Right.
or, give him a platform.
Right.
We're trying to gain insights into his psyche,
Right.
try to understand what led him down this dark path.
Yeah.
And his blog, disturbing as it is,
Right.
does offer this kind of window into his thoughts,
Right.
his justifications, his complete lack of remorse.
So what kind of things did he write about? I mean, was it all just self-pity and denial?
It's this strange mix of the mundane and the deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
He complains about prison life, the food, the boredom,
Right, the usual.
but then he'll just launch into this philosophical rant
Okay.
about society, religion, his belief that he's somehow a victim of fate.
It sounds like he was trying to construct a narrative,
Oh, yeah.
a way to explain away his actions without taking responsibility.
Exactly. He loves to use these analogies.
Okay.
He compares himself to a volcano,
Okay.
saying that he was destined to erupt.
Right.
It's just a way to deflect blame, to make himself seem like a force of nature,
Right.
rather than a man making conscious choices.
Did he ever talk about his victims? Did he express any remorse for the pain he caused?
That's the most chilling part of the whole blog. There's just this complete absence of genuine remorse.
Wow.
He rarely mentions the victims by name.
Yes.
And when he does, it's often in a way that dehumanizes them,
right,
minimizes their suffering.
It's like he's completely disconnected from the human cost of his actions.
Completely.
He's more concerned with his own discomfort, his own twisted philosophy.
Yeah, and that lack of empathy is a real hallmark of psychopathy. He's so consumed by his own worldview, his own justifications, that he just can't see beyond himself.
So his blog is this mix of self-pity,
right,
grandiosity, and just a complete lack of remorse.
It really is.
Did he ever offer any real insight into his motivations?
Well,
like, why did he do these things?
He hints at being abused as a child.
Okay.
But then contradicts himself in other posts.
Right.
He talks about his hatred for authority, his belief that the world is cruel and unjust.
Right.
But it's also fragmented. Just this jumbled mess of justifications and evasions.
It's almost as if he's trying to confuse us.
Yeah.
To muddy the waters so we can't pin down a clear motive.
And that's the danger of trying to analyze the mind of a psychopath.
Right.
There may not be a rational explanation.
Yeah.
A neat and tidy answer to the why question.
Right.
We have to be careful not to fall into the trap of trying to make sense of the senseless.
So what's the takeaway from all of this? What can we learn from Duncan's blog, as disturbing as it is?
The most important lesson, I think, is that evil often doesn't announce itself.
Right.
It can hide behind this mask of normalcy.
Right.
Duncan was able to blend in, present himself as this reformed offender,
right,
while harboring all these dark fantasies and violent urges.
It's a reminder that we can't always rely on outward appearances.
Right.
We have to be vigilant, trust our instincts,
yeah, absolutely,
pay attention to red flags.
And that brings us back to his website, The Fifth Nail.
Right.
This wasn't just a passive blog.
Right.
This was a carefully constructed persona.
Right.
A way to manipulate public perception and potentially even lure victims.
You mentioned earlier that the internet can be a breeding ground for darkness.
Yeah.
So how did Duncan use his website to further his twisted agenda?
Well, for starters, the name itself is significant.
Okay.
The fifth nail refers to a mythical nail from the crucifixion.
Okay.
Representing something hidden or forbidden.
Okay.
It sets a tone of secrecy, of something dark and taboo.
It's like he's inviting us into his twisted world.
Exactly.
A world where his own warped logic reigns supreme.
Right. And the content of the site just reinforces this. He writes about his struggles with his sexual urges, his fascination with violence, his anger towards women.
Wow.
It's all there, hidden in plain sight.
And no one saw this as a red flag.
Well,
no one thought to investigate further.
It raises questions about how we monitor online activity.
Right.
How we identify potential threats before they escalate into real-world violence.
Right.
Duncan was able to operate undetected for years using the internet to fuel his fantasies.
Right.
And potentially even connect with victims.
That's a terrifying thought.
It is.
It makes you wonder how many other predators are lurking online.
Right.
Hiding behind fake profiles.
Yeah.
Manipulating vulnerable individuals.
It's a reality we have to confront.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be naive about the dangers of the internet.
Right.
We need to be vigilant, educate ourselves and our children about online safety, and report any suspicious activity.
So we've explored Duncan's blog, his website, his carefully constructed online persona.
We have.
It's a disturbing picture. And it raises some serious questions about how we prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
It does. And I think one of the most important lessons we can learn is the importance of early intervention.
Yeah.
We saw how Duncan's pattern of violence started early with his first sexual assault at age 15.
That's a crucial point if there had been intervention then.
Right.
If he'd gotten the right kind of help.
Right.
Maybe the later tragedies could have been prevented.
It's impossible to say for sure.
Right.
But it really highlights the need for a multifaceted approach to prevention.
Okay.
We need better communication between law enforcement,
right,
mental health professionals, social services.
Right.
Too often, these systems operate in silos.
Right.
They fail to share information that could be crucial in identifying individuals at risk.
It's like a puzzle, and each piece of information could be a clue.
Exactly.
That helps us see the bigger picture.
Exactly. Second, we need to invest in early intervention programs. Targeting at-risk youth who exhibit warning signs of violent behavior.
Right. Yeah.
This could include therapy counseling, anger management, conflict resolution training.
All right.
The goal is to address these issues early on,
Right.
before they escalate into something more serious.
So it's about recognizing that violence isn't just something that happens overnight.
Right.
It's often the result of a long process of escalation.
Exactly.
And if we can interrupt that process,
Right.
we might be able to prevent tragedy.
Absolutely. And finally, we need to change the way we talk about mental health.
Okay.
We need to break down the stigma, encourage open conversations,
Right.
and make it easier for people to seek help when they need it.
It's about creating a culture where it's okay to not be okay.
Exactly.
Where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
Exactly. And that kind of cultural shift takes a collective effort
Right.
from individuals, families, communities, and institutions.
It's a big task, but it's a necessary one
It is.
if we want to create a safer, more compassionate world.
I agree completely. And while we're talking about systemic change,
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge the failures of the system in Duncan's case.
Right.
He was in and out of prison on parole,
Right.
and yet he was still able to commit these horrific crimes.
It seems like there were missed opportunities along the way.
Yeah.
Points where intervention could have made a difference.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to examine these systemic failures,
Yeah.
to learn from them, and to advocate for change.
Right.
We need to hold our institutions accountable,
Yeah.
demand more protection for our communities.
So we've explored the darkness,
We have.
the disturbing details of Duncan's crimes, his twisted online presence, the failures of the system.
Yeah,
It's heavy stuff.
it is, but remember, the goal of this deep dive isn't to leave us feeling hopeless or overwhelmed.
Right.
It's about understanding, learning, and using that knowledge to create a better future.
You're right. And speaking of a better future,
Yeah.
I think it's time to shift our focus to something a bit more hopeful, a bit more inspiring, the resilience of Shasta Grown.
Yes, let's explore how she turned unimaginable trauma
Yeah.
into a force for positive change.
Right.
A beacon of hope in the face of unspeakable darkness.
Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah,
the human spirit can find a way to heal, to grow, and to make a difference.
absolutely. And I think that's a really powerful message to leave our listeners with
Yeah.
as we move into the final part of this deep dive.
We spent the last two parts of this deep dive kind of exploring some really dark territory.
Yeah.
The details of Duncan's crimes, his twisted psychology,
Right.
the failures that allowed him to operate for so long.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up here, I think it's important to shift our focus to something a bit more hopeful.
Okay.
The idea of resilience,
Right.
finding light even in the darkest of places.
That's a really crucial point, and I think there's no better example of this than Shasta Grown. Despite enduring, unimaginable trauma, she found the strength not only to survive, but to become an advocate for change.
Yeah, her story is incredibly powerful.
It is.
Can you remind us about her advocacy work, specifically Slade and Dillon's Law?
Yeah, so in 2016, at just 19 years old, Shasta started a petition calling for stricter sentencing guidelines for sex offenders.
Okay.
The petition, named in honor of her brothers who were murdered by Duncan, argued that, those convicted of violent sex crimes should never be released from prison.
That's a really bold stance, and it really speaks to the depth of her pain
Yeah,
and her determination to prevent others from suffering a similar fate.
for sure.
What impact did her petition have?
Well, it didn't lead to any immediate legislative changes, but
Right.
it definitely reignited this critical national debate about how we handle the sentencing of sex offenders.
Yeah.
The voice of a survivor brought this really powerful human dimension to a conversation that often gets lost in legal technicalities and political maneuvering.
Yeah. It's a reminder that behind every statistic, every case file, there are real people,
Right.
real lives that
Yeah.
have been shattered by violence.
Exactly. And Shasta's advocacy work really highlights the need for a more holistic approach to justice.
Okay.
It's not just about punishment. It's
Yes.
about prevention, rehabilitation, and supporting victims in their journey towards healing.
You've touched on prevention a couple of times during this deep dive.
I have.
Given what we've learned about Duncan's pattern of escalating violence,
Right.
what are some concrete steps that we can take as a society
Well,
to identify and intervene with potential offenders before they reach this point?
it's a complex issue, but I think there are a few key areas to focus on.
Okay.
First, we really need to improve communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies,
Okay.
mental health professionals, and social services.
Right.
Too often, these systems operate in silos.
Right.
They fail to share information that could be crucial in identifying individuals at risk.
That makes sense. It's like a puzzle, and each piece of information could be a clue.
Exactly.
That helps us see the bigger picture.
Exactly. Second, we need to invest in early intervention programs.
Yeah.
Targeting at-risk youth who exhibit warning signs of violent behavior.
Okay.
This could include therapy, counseling, anger management, conflict resolution training.
Right.
The goal is to address these issues early on,
Right,
before they escalate into something more serious.
So it's about recognizing that violence isn't just something that happens overnight.
Right.
It's often the result of a long process of escalation.
Exactly.
And if we can interrupt that process,
right.
we might be able to prevent tragedy.
Absolutely. And finally, we need to change the way we talk about mental health.
Okay.
We need to break down the stigma, encourage open conversations,
Right.
make it easier for people to seek help when they need it.
It's about creating a culture where it's okay to not be okay.
Exactly.
Where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
Exactly. And that kind of cultural shift takes a collective effort.
Right.
From individuals, families, communities, and institutions.
It's a big task, but it's a necessary one.
It is.
If we want to create a safer, more compassionate world.
I agree. And while we're talking about systemic change, I think it's important to address the issue of the death penalty.
Right.
Duncan was sentenced to death.
Right.
But as we know, he died of natural causes.
Right.
This case kind of reignites this whole complex debate about the effectiveness,
Right.
the morality, the cost of capital punishment.
It's a conversation we can't shy away from.
Right.
There are strong arguments on both sides.
Yeah.
Some believe it provides a sense of justice and closure for the families of victims.
Yeah.
Others see it as a barbaric and inhumane practice.
It's a topic that deserves thoughtful consideration.
Yeah.
And I encourage our listeners to really explore the arguments and engage in respectful dialogue and form their own conclusions.
I think that's a great approach to any complex issue. Educate yourself, consider different perspectives.
Right.
And then form your own opinion.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that regardless of one's stance on the death penalty, the ultimate goal should be to create a society where these horrific crimes don't happen in the first place.
That's a really powerful point.
Yeah.
Instead of just reacting to violence, we should be focusing on preventing it.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in mindset.
Right.
A willingness to address the root causes of violence.
Right.
To invest in prevention and rehabilitation, and to create a culture of empathy and compassion.
Well said. And I think those are the perfect words to end our deep dive on.
They are.
We've explored a dark and disturbing chapter.
Yeah.
But we've also found, glimmers of hope.
For sure.
Of resilience.
Yeah.
Of the human spirit's ability to overcome even the most unimaginable challenges.
I agree. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us on this journey.
Yes.
It's not always easy to confront these difficult truths, but it's essential if we want to create a better world.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep diving deep.
Yeah.
And remember, even in the darkest of times, there's always the possibility of light.